Right. So I think we can get started here. So welcome everybody to this month's STEMS webinar. So we are very fortunate to have Stefano Castruccio as our speaker today. So Stefano is currently a Notre Dame Collegiate Associate Professor of Statistics at the University of Notre Dame. He obtained his PhD in statistics from the University of Chicago. After that, he was a postdoc at KAUST in Saudi Arabia. And from there, he moved to the UK. He was a lecturer at the Newcastle University before he joined Notre Dame. So Stefano works on various problems for spatiotemporal statistics in kind of complex environmental settings. So he's interested in applications ranging from air pollution to climate change and other kind of environmental problems. And in recent times, he has been especially working on these physics-informed machine learning techniques for spatiotemporal data, and that will be the topic of the talk today. So Stefano's title is, as we can see here, New Perspectives on Balancing Physics with Data-Driven Models, the Case for Physics-Informed Neural Networks in Environmental Statistics. So with that, Stefano, you can start whenever you're ready to go.
Okay. Thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation. So thanks everyone for sitting in this, for listening to me for this hour. Today, as the title suggests, I want to talk about some of my latest research at the interface between data-driven models, so typically neural networks, but you will see that most of the things I will talk about doesn't really have to be neural network. It can be really any statistical model, and how can we actually inform these large non-parametric models with the physics, and when is it appropriate or not. So before I start, just acknowledging my founder, Lucy Institute for Data and Society here in Notre Dame, NASA, NSF, and KAUST. They are funding the research of me and some of my students and postdocs. So before I start, just a little bit of kind of like, about myself, in the sense like what type of research I do, what type of research I will present. I'm a statistician, but I would consider myself somewhere between a methodological and an applied statistician. So you won't see any theory in this talk, because that's really not my thing. My area of expertise is more around geoscience and methods. And if I have to define, I think one way of I look at statistics, at least in my philosophy, it's best to summarize with the editorial that Michael Stein, my advisor, wrote in the Annals of Applied Statistics. Data are more important than models, and more models are more important than specific modes of inference. So I'm going to try and kind of give emphasis more on the data that I have, and I'm going to try to model, kind of, build a model around that. The inference is really not that important as far as I'm concerned, at least for this particular talk. So as far as like managing expectation, you can expect my talk to be somewhere around here. Okay, so methods and applications, really little bit, if nothing, really theoretical here. Okay, so I would like to start with like a very, 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 very generic question, which is, whenever you have a scientific problem, and this problem can be engineering problem, scientific, environmental, it really doesn't matter. Do you need additional context to this particular problem, or should you have kind of the data speak for themselves, right? And as any kind of super generic question, it deserves a super generic answer, right? So it depends, right? It depends on the context, it depends on the problem that I have, it depends on many things. However, I think we all agree that nowadays, for a very large class of problems, we tend to rely more and more on data-driven models. I mean, the past 10 years, I've seen this kind of explosion of non-parametric constructs called neural network, deeper, convolutional, transformers. All of them are variation of the same flavor, of like something non-parametric with a gigantic parametric space, okay? So they have been very popular in STEM and beyond, which prompts the question, should we just use and deploy those data-driven constructs anywhere and just forget about the context in the first place? And there are cases in which this is actually maybe a good idea, but there might be other cases in which we have spent maybe centuries trying and understanding some basic science, and should we just throw it away to just launch the latest AI model? So in some sense, when you think about data-driven methods and why Sorry, is there a question? I hear some. Okay.
I think it was some
uh,
background. Just go ahead.
Okay. So why do we need? I mean, one may argue, well, let's just use AI models, right? But if you do that, then you have the classical problem that, again, in statistics should not be surprising, which is that of extrapolation, right? If you train your model with some, we train your data with some highly non-parametric model, think about maybe just for the sake of simplicity, a high degree polynomial regression, then the moment you have to extrapolate for a different type of data, you have to do prediction, you end up ending up having something which may be nonsensical. This is an example of a temperature anomaly in the Pacific for El Nino. And if you just use a high polynomial regression here, in red, you can see your prediction is just going to go crazy after a few time steps, whereas the data are more around here. Okay, so you do need physics to constrain some problems, right? And it would be a shame if we just deploy the latest, the deepest, the best possible AI model, forgetting about all of this. It's actually helpful. So how can we do that? So if you think about this problem, you may kind of be tempted to think about a dichotomy. Okay, so on one hand, you have a situation in which we have like very well-known equations. Okay, maybe you have a few data which are hard and expensive to get. And in this case, you know the physics or you know the dynamics of the process. And I am talking about, for example, Navier-Stokes, so in fluidomechanics, or maybe Schrodinger equation or special or general relativity. So those are equations which have been widely validated. And so we know how reality kind of behaves according to these equations. And we have spent hundreds of years studying these things, and the equations are based on basic principles such as preservation of energy or momentum. On the other hand, we have kind of the big data realm, the AI realm, where we have unknown or non-existing equations, such as human behavior in social networks, for example. We may have a lot of data which are cheap and ubiquitous, and therefore we deploy very sophisticated AI models, right? And I'm talking large language models, GPT-3, foundation models, any type of like very complicated machine learning. Okay. Now, one of the kind of point that I want to make is that these two things don't really have to be kind of adversarial. And in fact, our duty as modelers should be to try and get the best of two worlds to kind of model better, to have better predictions and to understand better the phenomenon that we want to talk about. So has this been done before? So yes, in statistics, in fact, there is a long and well-established literature on merging physics with statistics. Some people call it assimilating, fusing data. It has all sorts of names depending on the subdiscipline you talk about. In statistics, I think the best name is physical statistical models. And I didn't come up with his name, of course. It was Mark Berliner in his 2003 paper in JGR, in which he basically was the first one who kind of formalized the notion of physical statistical models, the idea of merging physics within a statistical model. And there is a quote here for one of the latest book by Chris Weichel, Andrew Zammit, and Noel Cressy. We say that spatiotemporal statistical models are not at odds with deterministic ones, or physical ones, as I'm calling them. Indeed, the most powerful models are constructed based on physical mechanisms. So the most powerful models are indeed the ones who take the best of the two worlds, okay, who exploit the flexibility of physical models, the added flexibility given by the uncertainty or the functional structure on top of the physics. So how do physical statistical models work? So they work in the following way. Basically, in a picture, they take all the equations of a particular problem and they feed them inside the black box, okay, which would be the model explaining the dynamics of the process. Okay, so this is very kind of qualitative. So allow me now to be a bit more quantitative and to kind of formalize what is a physical statistical models for my perspective, and where does the new insights from machine learning come from. Now, physical statistical models, they kind of fit naturally in something that we call the hierarchical Bayesian framework. So we model things not as a whole in space and time, but conditionally. In particular, if we assume that we observe some data zt of S, where, as always, t is time and S is the space, can be 2 or 3 dimensional, it doesn't really matter. we assume that everything behaves according to some marginal distribution. You can think about the exponential family. You can think about the Gaussian if you want to make things very simple. This member from the exponential family has a latent process, which I'm going to call yt of s, is controlled by some parameters theta data, and it may or may not have additional uncertainty controlled by epsilon of s. Okay, so data model error would be epsilon of s. Data model parameters would be this vector here, theta data, where the data on the superscript denotes, in fact, the fact that the parameters are related to the marginal behavior. Okay, H can be a linear or nonlinear mapping. Again, it doesn't really matter. What matters is that I am kind of decoupling the notion of observation from the one of a process. Okay, I care about the process and not the observation itself. Okay, stage number 2 of a classical hierarchical Bayesian models, I model the dynamics in space and in time of the process. Now I have my latent process, the one that I want to study, that I kind of cleaned from outside noise, and I want to understand how it changes. So, and I will be assuming that this will change according to some dynamic process M, and which depends on past legs. It can be a t-1 all the way to t-k. It can also be depending on the entire history from the first observation. It will be controlled by some data model parameters, which I call theta process, and it can have additional uncertainty, which is called process model error, eta of t. Okay, so stage 1, marginal, you decouple data from process. Stage 2, spatiotemporal dynamic of the process. Stage 3, the priors, which I'm not going to talk about if you want to do Bayesian inference. It's actually not even necessary. You could, in principle, be doing everything in a frequentist flavor. The key point is this kind of two-stage approach, which allows us to actually focus on the process and its dynamics. So where does the physics statistical model comes into play? It comes into play into the function M. So the function M is the dynamic process. If I have to explain how the process evolves, I may as well just feed inside there the equations which pertains the particular problem that I am discussing, okay? And this can be, is very much context dependent. If it's fluidodynamics, I'm gonna feed inside there Navier-Stokes. If it's, again, other type of processes maybe coming from biology or from engineering structural problems, which are derivations of Newton's law, you can feed them inside here. The point is that any type of physical information should be hardwired into the functional shape of the dynamic process M. Okay? Okay, so what is the problem? Okay, so this approach has been widely used, and the main kind of issue here is that in order for this to work, you need to be absolutely confident about the functional shape of M. So you are assuming that your physics is actually a hard constraint on the dynamics of the process. If something goes wrong, you can only hope that eta of t, this kind of uncertainty, kind of somehow fixes whatever goes wrong into your model misspecification. But the physics is hardwired inside the functional shape of M. There is no escape. So you can only hope for fixing it later. Okay? So this is the physical statistical model. And in the last few years, machine learning has kind of come up with like a relatively different approach on how to actually model physics with data, which is called physics-informed neural networks, which is really the beginning of my journey as far as my contributions to this field. The idea is quite different, as you will see in a second, but you will appreciate, as when I will show you the equations, that it's actually not that different. I mean, there is a link with physical statistical models and physics-informed neural networks. It's just somehow lost. And for whatever reason, I really never found it in the literature, at least in the machine learning literature. And I had a discussion, a long discussion with one of my colleagues in computer science as to why it is the case. And I think at the end of the day, kind of my conclusion, the conclusion of the discussion was that, you know, it's never been published in a machine learning proceeding. So really nobody kind of, I think, bothered or wanted really to investigate this kind of link between physical statistical models and pins. But it's there. and we should understand it in order to make a better contribution. So the main idea of pins, which again, it's something which is about maybe 6 years old, 7 years old now, is that instead of hardwiring the physics inside the model, we treat the problem as a scale. So on one side, we have the physical information or the context of the problem. And on the other side, we have a data-driven model. Okay, so it can be a statistical model. It can have its own, it can be linear regression just as much as it could be a convolutional neural network. It doesn't really matter. Okay, so the question is, how much do you trust the physics with respect to how much do you trust the data kind of learning themselves the structure of the problem? Okay, it's not a matter of taking the physics and kind of squeezing it inside the black box, but rather treat these two things as kind of separate entities, each one of which does require its own relative weight. Okay, so how does it work? So what I will be doing in the next couple of slides, I will be kind of presenting pins not as the way they have been presented in machine learning, but the way I kind of reformulate pins as a statistical model, because I believe, after all, they are just another approach to perform inference on hierarchical Bayesian models. So stage one is the same. So these equations here are just blatantly copy-pasted from the previous slides, okay? We have decoupled observation with a process. So everything is the same as before. And now I need to focus on the spatiotemporal dynamics of the process, y t of s, okay? So I can have an exponential family, a Gaussian, it doesn't really matter, okay? The change is in the stage two. So in the stage two, your latent process is evolving according to M, but now M is not some sort of hardwired physics. However, it's a highly non-parametric neural network. Okay, so it can be a very deep network, can be network in space, in time, it can be both, it doesn't matter. It's something which will have an incredibly large parametric space now, okay, because it's a neural network. So the physics is not inside the model. The model is a neural network or a hierarchical Bayesian model by design. There will still be process model error in here, and you can put priors if you want, although it's a much more complicated problem now because you have an incredibly large parametric space, but you could in principle be using approximate Bayesian methods, variational inference and things like that. Okay, so where does the physics comes into play? It comes into play into the way we do inference about y of t. So we assume now that y of t can be informed by a partial differential equation. And this partial differential equation can be one, can be a system. It doesn't matter, it can be linear, nonlinear. That's irrelevant. We're just going to call this PDE derivative of y of t with respect to t minus some sort of differential operator y of t equal to 0. The key point of physics-informed neural network is that we don't want to hardwire the physics inside the process, but we want to have a process which is loosely compliant with the physics. So we are allowing some amount of flexibility to the non-compliance, but we want to be able to control somehow to what extent this process is actually compliant with the physics. So how can we do that? It's actually very easy. In statistics, we have been doing this for hundreds of years. We use penalties. So I'm going to call g of y of t the difference between this derivative and this differential operator. We know that it has to be equal to 0 in order for the PDE to be correct. So here I'm just going to put this as a penalty. So I'm going to have here a sum of the cost function with respect to the observations. Bear in mind here I have z of t. So I have a cost function with respect to the observations, and I'm going to have a penalty controlled by a parameter lambda, for which here I have a g of y hat of t, which represents, in fact, the penalty that which represents, the departure with respect to which the process has to the PDE. Okay, so on one side I have my usual fit cost function. It can be the usual square for a case of a Gaussian process, and I have a penalty. It's like doing ridge or lasso, except the penalty is informed by the partial differential equation. So we minimize this. We want to minimize this expression here. If you want to kind of have a simpler expression, you can think about the Gaussian process. And in the case of the Gaussian process, this becomes just this expression here. You also have in this case that the latent process is the mean function. So you can actually simplify this expression as well. Okay. Now, the key point is that I'm not solving the PD. So I'm not putting myself in a situation in which I have an inverse problem. In fact, I treat my PD as a forward problem, meaning I feed the fitted values inside the PD, the fitted values generated by my machine learning model, and I just evaluate this PD forward. I'm not solving it. This is considerably more computationally convenient than actually solving it. So that's the good news. The bad news is that there is typically no closed form expression, okay? Because the PD, I have a PD and I have a deep model. So, there is not like linear regression where I have X transpose X minus 1, X transpose Y. I need to actually, get my hands dirty as far as the minimization is concerned. However, I can actually compute a gradient numerically or with symbolic calculus, and I can use backpropagation. And so I can solve it just as I would solve any gradient descent method in machine learning. I feed this into Keras or PyTorch, and I would have the results, okay? As long as you can provide derivatives with respect to the PD, which is indeed possible to do. Okay, so just one additional thing I want to say. Some of you may have seen this kind of framework here on the top, the one that I'm proposing, in a different context in functional data analysis. In fact, there is Laura Sangalli and her group in Milano, which have worked on a relatively similar problem in a functional setting. They have defined something called, I think it's in the context of functional spatial regression, in which they have a penalty, which in this case is the integral of a PD. Okay, so again, even from a certain point of view, there is already kind of a theoretical justification for this in a continuous space. Okay, in this case, here I'm dealing not with the functional forms, so I'm not decomposing my solution in a Hilbert space or anything like that. I'm actually working with neural network. But the point is that even this idea of penalization with respect to the PDE has been around for some time in statistics as well, just under a different name, not physics-informed neural networks. Okay, so this is all kind of high-level work. So where does my contribution comes into play? So I'm going to present only two of my works here. One of these has been recently published in JASA, and it's about basically developing a flexible temporal model for M in the case of a Gaussian process and inform it with a PDE in an experimental fluidodynamics problem. So I will be using Navier-Stokes in a water tunnel here, and my M will be a particular type of temporal neural network. So I will be using something called an initial state network. For those of you who are not familiar with it, you can think of it as kind of like a Kalman filter, except the dynamics of the Kalman filter, which are here in the omega t, are actually controlled by some nonlinear function g, and those matrices of weights w and wx. And the weights are, these matrices here are assumed to be Bayesian, meaning they have a prior which is highly sparse, and each entry of this matrix will be zero with a certain probability, and if they're not zero, they will be drawn from a symmetric distribution around zero. If you're familiar with Bayesian statistics, this should be very familiar. This is a Spike-and-Slab prior, okay? So I will be assuming that my W and WX are, in fact, here, those W and WX here are coming from a Spike-and-Slab prior. Why is that important? Well, because instead of estimating the W and the WX, all the individual entries, I now have just parameters of a statistical distribution to estimate, which is a considerably smaller parametric space. But of course, there is no free lunch. So you have additional flexibility and sparsity in exchange for a less precise model. And we try to kind of patch these additional uncertainty with some error, because this type of approach here will give you a different metrics for every different realization. Okay, so this approach has been around for 15 years or so. It's called issue state network. There is a broad literature on this. Chris Weichel and his group, they've done a fantastic job into kind of introducing this to the statistics community. I think it was 5 years ago. So, and I kind of use their ideas here. Here is, yeah, I'm just showing you the shallow version, but I'm actually using deep networks because they're more flexible. So you can think of an iterative version with multiple G's, which are the activation functions. Okay, so what is an initial state network? An initial state network, if you want to have a picture, I think this is my favorite one. Your input gets inside these matrices W here, and these matrices W's are called in machine learning reservoirs, and they're kind of, I don't know where there comes the kind of the similarity, but basically you can think of them as like fluid stuff that every time takes a different shape. And in like the original idea, this kind of fluidity should be associated with the stochastic nature of W. Okay. So once you have the reservoir, you have realized the reservoir, then you map your input, which can be the past observations, of course, into your actual observation at time t through some linear expression B of t. Okay, so this is a classical approach for modeling data in time using a neural network that doesn't require an incredibly large amount of parameters. I'm also using another approach. So I'm not just using initial state network, but I'm also using something called deep liquid state machines. I mean, it's a fairly, the mathematical description is fairly long, so I'm not gonna go into the details. The main idea is that basically it's another reservoir approach which treats the data as a sequence of spikes, okay? So it's trying to really mimic information as it comes into our brain, into a sequence of spikes where the spikes are the electric signals into the brain, okay? This is part of a kind of, it's called the third generation neural networks, I think, which are trying to mimic more closely what the brain does. There is a static version of liquid state machine, which is in fact called spiking neural networks. The idea is that you transform the data into a sub-process with a firing rate proportional to the trained data. And that's called the spike train. So the spike trains are used as input here in your reservoir approach, and then your output will be another sequence of spikes. So you can think of these weights here, these nodes here, as actually being actual neurons, okay, in the biological sense. They absorb a sequence of electrical signal and they spit out another sequence of electrical signals, the synapses of the brain. So there is a model for that if you want to be a little bit more precise. The way it works is exactly as it works in the brain. Basically, a signal comes, the neurons accumulates energy up until it reaches a certain threshold, which is called V memory here, this threshold here. VTHR, which is the threshold. Once the potential energy, once the electricity inside the synapse, the cell reaches a certain value, the cell fires a burst of information, and then it goes into rest. So it loses all the energy, okay? So this here represents basically the model. So there is a sub-process inside the time series which is trying to do exactly this. So the potential energy of, we call the membrane, the actual neurons, is equal to its past value plus you sum every single possible new input. There is also something called leak, which, you know, that basically the idea is that the cell can actually lose some of the energy, maybe to sustain itself or for other reasons. And if you fire, then you kind of have a value of 1 for this. So you signal a 1 here. Otherwise, otherwise nothing happens and you keep accumulating energy. Okay, so at the end of the day, you count how many spikes you had in an interval, and this is what you feed inside the reservoir. Now, the picture is actually a little bit more complicated than that, because there is also something called, there is a latent period after firing, again, which mimics the behavior of the brain. Once a neuron has fired, it kind of stays to rest for some time. And there is also something called lateral inhibition. So since the neurons are all packed together, if one fires, the other one kind of stay quiet for some time, okay? So this spiking neural network is actually something which is like the issue state network in the sense that it has a reservoir, but its behavior is much more akin to that of a biological, the brain, the biological behavior of the brain. Okay, so at the end of the day, we kind of take these two things together, we squeeze them together in something which is like an ensemble model, and we call it just ensemble reservoir in this case. They are both deep models, and we mix them together to have a better dynamics in time, okay, by mixing them together. Now, being a statistical model, of course, I also need to provide assessments of the uncertainty. I will not provide you with the equations. You can read the paper if you want. They're complicated. The idea is that basically you do all the trick in the book. You take your training data and your testing data. You build your confidence around your training data, and you look at the testing data, and you look whether, say, a 95% confidence interval for the prediction covers, in fact, 95% of the observations on average. If not, you kind of adjust your interval, assuming that the data are Gaussian. Okay, this is basically what's going on in step number 1 and 2. And then you impose an additional constraint that as you go further in time, as you make your prediction further into the future, you want your uncertainty to increase. So you fit a monotonic spline to the estimated uncertainty in this process. And since we also have data in space, at the end of the day, you fit a spatial model. But crucially, I am working under the assumption that there are not so many data in space in the first place. So I don't really bother too much providing a nice and complicated geostatistical model. The key point here is the penalty with respect to the physics and the temporal dynamics. Okay, so the application relatively quickly. So we have velocity data on of water flow in a tunnel. So I will be we have data from our collaborators. We were given high resolution flow from a tunnel, and the tunnel is done in a certain way. Basically, there is a wall on the bottom, and the water flows into one direction. So as it stays close to the wall, there is turbulence, and as you move further away from the bottom of from the wall, then you have something called the laminar flow. So the flow is undisturbed. Okay, so there is a transition between a kind of chaotic behavior due to the friction of the fluid with the wall, the barrier, and then as you go up, it becomes undisturbed. Okay, we have extremely high resolution, 2,500 time steps at frequency of 1,000 hertz. So we observe 2.5 seconds. We have observations every fraction of a second, basically. Okay, and my goal is to provide a physically consistent forecasting. So I'm going to apply my double reservoir, or I should call it ensemble reservoir approach, and inform it with the physics of this particular problem here. So how do I do that? Well, first of all, just a kind of some understanding of the data. If you were to take, I'm just going to take my observations in a subsample of points because I have observations everywhere. I'm just going to take a subsample of them. You can find them here where the crosses are. So this on the x-axis is the wall, is my domain in the x-axis, and this is my y-axis. If you average all the velocities of the fluid in time and across the y component, across the x component, you end up with this curve here, which starts at 0 basically and goes all the way up here. Okay, it means that because of the something called no slip condition here at the beginning, the fluid is stuck on the wall, and then its velocity gradually increases until it reaches a point where it's undisturbed by the flow, and that's like laminar flow, so no turbulence at all. Okay, the question is, we know this is happening, and we know we would like to kind of provide a forecast by using some of the basic properties of this fluid that we know can be studied with Navier-Stokes, because it's a fluid that comes in and gets out, so there has to be some preservation of energy, some preservation of momentum. We would like to inform our prediction with these basic facts. So there is a relatively long derivation in the paper, in the supplementary material, in which we took the full three-dimensional Navier-Stokes, and we did a lot of, because of the relatively simple experimental setting, we kind of start trimming it down with assumptions, which are reasonable in this case, and we ended up with basically something called the RANS solution in one dimension, one-dimensional basically RANS solution to Navier-Stokes, which look like this. It's a non-linear ordinary differential equation. It depends on some numbers. Theta is the boundary layer thickness, which we know because we are in experimental settings, so we know how much is it. RE is the Reynolds number. If you have ever worked with fluid dynamics, you should probably know everything about the Reynolds number. It's a measure of basically turbulence in the fluid. And the U of theta is the friction velocity, which is another property of the experimental setting. So I am assuming that I do know the physics here, okay? So I'm in a situation in which those parameters are known. In fact, I could be generalizing this framework in the case where these parameters are unknown. And there is some work that we have done in the paper in this regard, but I want to keep things simple here, assuming that the physics is in fact known. Okay, so the results. So in a nutshell, if you use the physics, it's going to be better. Okay. So here you can find the mean squared error for the training set. We withheld some observations with physics and without physics. And this one here in parentheses is the uncertainty with respect to all the points that we have taken and all the times. And if you were to plot this one here in this, the dashed red line represents the equality between mean squared error with physics and without physics. And if you were to compare that in time and with locations, you have an overwhelming evidence that indeed the mean squared error without the physics is going to be smaller than the one with the physics. So using the physics actually does help in predicting and informing our model, because we are in this very controlled situation and because the Navier-Stokes equation in this particular sense is well describes the phenomenon at hand. We can also do uncertainty quantification if we calibrate the model according to the process that I kind of showed you a picture about. Things work out, okay? Without going too much into the details. If you do not calibrate a 95% confidence interval, it's just too wide, covers everything. If you do the calibration, 95% covers 95, 90 covers 90, 80 covers 80, and look at the uncertainty here with respect to the nearby point, with respect to all the points and in time, it's fairly small. So I've managed to kind of control the uncertainty and, manage, a 95% confidence interval is actually now a 95% confidence interval. So it's well controlled. It works. So wrapping up on the first part, I think the main message besides the technicality is that a pin is just a penalized statistical model. It's nothing, no more, no less than that, okay? We have seen penalized models in statistics since the dawn of time. We may as well everything that we know about that. It works very well in the cases in which the physics is known, but of course the price to pay is that you cannot just deploy your neural network. You need you need to study a lot the problem that you are dealing with, because Navier-Stokes does require some expertise to manipulate. We can do uncertainty quantification, and if we wanted, we could also estimate the parameters of the equations, like the physical parameters of the PDE, and put them as additional parameters in our framework. That's possible, and it works. And again, we have results in the paper. Okay, so the second work was again with the same kind of flavor, so physics penalization, except in this case I had a much larger data set in space, so I couldn't just take some very simple geostatistical model, maybe Matern or something. I need something a bit more interesting. But the idea is the same. I still have the same framework, the same two-step process, which I have the marginal distribution here and the latent process, and M is some sort of neural network. In this case, the neural network is a neural network in space and a neural network in time. So it's going to be more complicated. Before, I only had neural networks in time and some relatively simple patch in space because I only had not a lot of observations, whereas here I need to pull out the big guns as far as spatial modeling is concerned. So we generated in the second work a pin to generate moralization from a numerical model. That's what's called typically a stochastic weather generator or an emulator. Now people call it a digital twin, but it's the same idea. And we used a convolutional autoencoder in space, and the recurrent neural network in time, okay? And we informed these equation again with Navier-Stokes. We didn't use the same problem as before. In this case, as I said, we have simulated data. In particular, I will be focusing on something called the Rayleigh-Bernard convection, which you can think of basically kind of like having two plates, one which is hotter than the other, and you can see the fluid, which could be water, which could be air, doesn't really matter, which kind of goes up because of convection, and then it cools down and it goes down, okay? So something that goes up and down. Maybe there is a very small animation here. You can see the fluid going up, and then it kind of mixes together with the cold one, okay? So again, this is a very controlled setting with Navier-Stokes that we can control. You can write down the equations. Now it's not as simple as having one ordinary differential equations. We need to have velocity fields as much as temperature and pressure in 2 dimensions. So it's a system of partial differential equations. However, there is, again, if you work with Navier-Stokes, you work with your collaborators, you find out something that is computationally manageable, and you end up with this system of equations here, which again, as I said, do represent Navier-Stokes, which in turn represents preservation of momentum and energy. Okay, so we simulated data on a grid, 256 by 256, and 1,000 time points. So here you can see just an example of some of the variables I'm dealing with. So this is UV, so the velocity in the U and the V component of the fluid. P is the pressure field, and theta here is perhaps the most interesting one, is the temperature. Okay, so the temperature which is hotter on the bottom and colder on the upper hand. Okay, I'm assuming I have no gravity here, so I don't put any gravitational effects just to make my life simpler, because the fluid in principle should also be attracted by gravity if the plates are far enough or the gravitational field is very strong. Okay, so let's go back to my setting here. So as a reminder, I need to now provide a model in space and in time. So I would be assuming that my spatial structure is something called the convolutional autoencoder. And my model, the way it works is that basically I am taking my spatial fields. I have multiple spatial fields here because I have UV, pressure, and temperature. And I'm going to do convolutional neural networks and pooling them, so reducing their dimension multiple times until I have some kind of tiny collection of parameters. And then I'm going to do the opposite operation, and I'm going to unpack them with something called the deconvolutional neural network, so which acts as the kind of specular opposite of a convolutional neural network. And in this way, you kind of recover what hopefully is as close as possible as the original image that you had. Okay, that's something from image recognition. It's a form of compression, if you like, which encodes your spatial data into parameters and then recodes them into the original field. So I have an encoder and a decoder, and it's a dimensional reduction technique. As far as I am concerned, it's not that different from like predictive processes, partial principal component analysis. It's just a nonlinear version of it, basically. And in a picture, if you're familiar with machine learning, I'm sure you've seen this picture before. You kind of keep doing these layers of convolutions and also pooling information across nearby observations. You keep doing that for your fields here. You're left with this x tilde of t, which is your reduced information. And then you model this in time. And then here you do the deconvolution, and eventually you recover something which is hopefully as close as possible as your original field. So that's how a convolutional neural network works. In time, I'm using something called a long short-term memory, which is not a reservoir computing, is a more complicated model. I don't have time to deal into like technical details about it, but basically it's a standard model in machine learning. I'm assuming that basically there is an evolution in time according to some neural networks. So fairly standard stuff as far as machine learning is concerned. Okay, so does it work? Yes, it does. Here you can see some of our results. Here I'm just comparing different spatial compression techniques, fixed rank ranking PCA, independent component analysis, and convolutional autoencoder. You can see that convolutional autoencoders are typically like 2 orders of magnitude better than PCA. And why is that? It's just because it's a nonlinear process with many more parameters. So of course, you would hope you have more flexibility into kind of compressing your spatial information into a set of parameters for convolution. What about the forecast? If you were to do convolutional autoencoders and then model things in time with an ARMA model, with an issue-state network, with a recurrent neural network, you don't have nearly exactly good results. If you inform it with physics, you can go, your mean squared error can go down as low as 0.22 with respect to, say, non-physics informed ARMA, which has 5 orders of magnitude worse results. Okay, so we inform the physics and we use this kind of long short-term memory. It does improve our predictive skills dramatically by doing that. All right, so these two works that I've shown you are, I think, represents kind of in a nutshell my journey into learning physics informed neural networks. I got very interested in those things because they were new, so I started reading about them, and it's kind of representative of maybe the Dunning-Kruger effect. So I got super excited at the beginning about these spins. I thought they would kind of revolutionize the way we do analysis, the way we analyze data in space and time. Then, as I kind of start studying them more and more, I realized that physical statistical models for the VAR, data simulation literature has already done everything. So I got a little bit more in the low end of the Dunning-Kruger. And then eventually kind of recovered that by realizing that in fact there is still some work to be done, some important work to be done, because physics informed neural network has this kind of crucial idea for which you can trade off physical information with data-driven models. So there is still value into using them for modeling data in space and time. You just have to be careful about not discarding everything that has been done in the statistical literature in the past few decades. Okay, so where do we go next? So I'm doing some work right now with WRF LES. So one of the main criticism on the work that I've done would be to say this is all very interesting, but this is very idealized cases of Navier-Stokes in a very controlled setting. Does it work if I were to go on a much larger scale, maybe LES or even larger mesoscale models like WRF? Can I actually penalize my physics informed neural network with respect to the Navier-Stokes equations within WRF? So this is not just a scientific problem, but also a coding problem, because that would require to actually evaluate my predictions according to my neural networks and hard code them inside the Fortran code of WRF. Fortunately, I don't have to do it. My students have to do it. So it's their job. But after all, we seem to be making some preliminary initial interesting progress on this. And I'm focusing on the SWEX experiment, which is studying something called sundowners, which are events in California of strong winds by the coast, which have strong implications for wildfires, as recent news have also acknowledged. Okay, so other interesting projects correlated to this. I am working on a project with NASA on physics informed neural networks and emulators. I mean, if this works for data, why not use them as emulators? I have a work which is almost done on physics informed priors, because whenever there is a penalty, there is a prior, right? So it's like ridge regression. It's like a Bayesian regression with Gaussian priors. Can we play the same game here? The answer is yes. I am trying to use similar ideas to reconstruct vegetation in the Holocene in the Midwest in another NSF project. I'm trying to push emulations of these physics-informed ideas to the exascale. So we actually won the Gordon Bell Prize last year on a project which is like this idea of pushing emulators to extremely complicated, extremely large, I should say, climate models at very high resolutions. I'm also using some of these ideas as a means of compression, and I've given you already some flavor for that. When you talk about convolutional autoencoders, you can think about them. You can think about them as compression. So here is more or less the same idea. I have some work on visualizing these results in 3D environment with virtual reality. And I'm trying to apply some of these ideas into high energy particle physics, especially their optics and also some lake dynamics effect. So I think it's a fairly flexible ideas. And, if anybody's interested in like exploring how we can kind of nudge some of the physics inside a particular problem. I think this idea is actually fairly promising. Okay. So with this, I'm done with this. So, thanks very much for your attention, and, open the floor for discussion.